Alrighty folks, it's time for an introduction to Git. So within this lesson, what we're going to do is firstly talk about what Git is, then we'll cover off a little bit of a dive into the technical side of how it actually works. We'll discuss how you can use it remotely, and we'll also talk about how you can get set up on your own machine. So let's go ahead and take a look. First things first, what is Git? What are we trying to use this tool for? Well, at the core, Git is a source control system. It's something that helps developers to manage all of the different files and folders and assets that are required for building their solution. Now, just like many other source control systems, one of the foundational features of Git is that of version control. So developers can very easily go and track the changes that they make to their files, have things like branching and merging, and so on. Now, Git has become really popular for a number of different reasons. Firstly, it's open source, and it's also very lightweight. It's easy to install across multiple different operating systems, very simple command line tool that can be used to perform a range of different operations, whether they are manual or being automated. It's probably also due in part to the fact that Git operates as a distributed source control system, or distributed version control system, DVCS, as they are commonly referred to as. When you have a Git repository that houses all of your source code, you can go ahead, set up collaboration, provide access to multiple different developers, and when they use this system, they're actually going to fully download your source code. They'll get full access to the entire set of files, folders, and even the entire history as well. So that can be really handy for a number of reasons. And one of those is also the fact that even if you go fully offline, well, if you're using Git, you've got that entire repository on your system. You can keep developing and you can synchronize those changes later. So that's a high-level overview of what Git is. What I want to do next is dive a little bit deeper and understand how this actually works. Let's say that we've got some sort of remote Git repository set up. That might be GitHub, Azure DevOps, GitLab, Bitbucket, or any one of the other major Git providers. So if you've got one of these services set up and you've created a Git repository online, then we consider that a remote repository. Let's say that within this repository, you've actually got a couple of different files. And what you want to do is you want to collaborate with other developers to work on this solution. So what is going to happen with Git is you're actually going to have multiple users accessing that one remote repository. And when they do so, they're actually going to have a full copy of that source code, including all the edits, all the revisions, all the history, the ability to roll back changes that have been made. Okay, really, you've kind of got an entire copy of that source control system on each of the developer computers. So this is why we often refer to Git as a distributed version control system. And also, of course, we have the basic sort of functionality, like the ability for one developer to go and make some changes, add some code, delete some files, whatever it might be, and synchronize those changes all across the board through a range of push and pull operations that the different developers can perform. So that's what we're talking about with Git. Now, when you go and actually use this on your computer, there's some things that we should know. Let's say, for example, you've got Git installed on your computer and you've set up a new folder on your computer where you want to go and create some different files, and you've decided you're going to use Git to help you manage those files. You're creating some code, some scripts, whatever it might be. Now, if you're doing this on your computer, the first thing you're going to do is actually perform a command called git init. That is going to create a Git repository for you on your computer. This is if we are starting out on our computer and we're not actually taking a copy of a Git repository that exists remotely somewhere else. Now, when we use Git, whether or not we have created the repository on our computer or cloned it from someone else's repository, there's two things we need to know. Within our Git repository, we actually have something that looks like this. We have a staging area and we have the actual repository itself. Now, the reason we need to know this is because as developers, when we're working with our code, we can use these two areas to our advantage. So let's say, for example, we go and create a single script, maybe just a PowerShell script, a bash script, whatever it might be. You create some file within your computer in the working directory that you've performed the git init operation within. Now, once you've made changes to that file, you've got it ready to go, maybe you've completed all you really need for that script, you're going to want to insert that somehow into your repository. Now, the way that that works is as follows. First things first, we can perform a command called git add. We're going to specify the name of the file and so forth, and that's actually going to create a copy of that file within the staging area for our repository. Now, the staging area can be helpful because it's for exactly that purpose, for staging changes that you're about to make. Maybe you're actually working across a range of different files for a given solution, and you know that you're making changes to a range of them, so you're going to add them to the staging area, but you're not going to do anything with that yet. You might be making some further changes still. But at some point in time, you're going to say, okay, I've finished making all of the changes that I want for one or more different files. At that point, you're saying, I'm happy, I'm ready to go. I want to save these changes. I want to commit them. And that's where you're going to use the git commit command. Now, git commit is really just going to say, I'll take that file and I'll move it into the repository and I'll say, this is it. This is now the copy. This is kind of the source of truth, if you like, and it's exactly now what exists within your repository. Now, what we've spoken about so far has been working on your own local computer, but very often when you're using Git, you're going to be working remotely as well. So let's say you've been through the steps that we just discussed, and what you've actually decided is, okay, I've got this repo that I've created locally, I'm ready to go with some changes that I've injected in there, but I want to store this remotely as well. What you might do then is go ahead and create a GitHub account and go and create a new remote Git repository. Now, if this is the case, if you've followed the steps that we've just discussed, what you're going to want to do is somehow synchronize your local repository with the remote repository that you've just created. To do that, what we can actually do is we can type the git remote add command and we'll enter in some details about that remote repository. Now, what we're actually doing when we perform that command is kind of creating a connection between our local repository and the remote repository that we've just configured. And if you do have changes ready to go within your repository that don't currently match the remote repository, you can go ahead and type the git push command, and that's going to make sure that the remote repository becomes synchronized with your local repository. So folks, that's a little bit behind the scenes or under the hood, if you like, of how Git actually works. And it is important to understand these because you will be using these commands when you develop solutions and you want to store that within Git. Now, one thing I would just say before we move on to setting up your own environment is that commonly you're actually not going to perform these steps in the order that we just followed them. Some people will actually recommend that what's better to do if you are just getting started with Git and you did want to work remotely is to actually start remotely first. So what do I mean by that? Well, rather than going and initializing a local repository, I'd suggest that you go and set up your remote repository first. Get a GitHub account, an Azure DevOps account, Bitbucket, whatever it might be. Set up your remote repository, and then we can do something called git clone. Now, when we perform that git clone command on our computer and we specify our remote repository that we created, it's kind of going to perform that process in reverse. It's going to initialize that repository for us, but it's specifically going to do so by taking a copy of that remote repository. Now, it is often recommended to follow this order rather than starting on your computer, just in case maybe the enterprise that you work with has actually set up some defaults for your remote repositories. And that way, if you clone the repository, you'll get all of those defaults ready to go. Also, if you had some files that actually did already exist in that repository, then it's going to be much easier to take a clone of all of those files first and then start working and making changes, maybe adding files and pushing those changes once you're done. So other than that, the process will be exactly the same as what we've just discussed. You've now got that linked repository. You can create some files in your working directory. When you're ready to go, you can add them to staging. And when you're happy that they are complete, you can commit them. And finally, of course, once you want to synchronize, you can perform a git push as well. Alrighty folks, so you've now learned the basics of what Git is and how you can use it and the different areas that we need to be aware of. There are of course a range of different other commands that you can use and other features that you might get access to depending on the remote Git provider that you are using. But these are just the basics that you do need to know. Now, if you do want to get started working with Git, you are of course going to have to set up your computer. So let's quickly talk about that now. What you're going to have to do to set up Git is install the client on your machine. Git does support both Windows, Mac, and Linux, so you can go to the official Git website and you can download the client that suits your operating system. Now that's pretty much all there is actually to it to having Git ready to go on your computer. You're of course going to initialize any repos or clone repos that you want to work with. One thing I would say is that there are a couple of commands that you're probably going to want to type as soon as you've got set up, and that's the following. We can type git config --global, and then specify the user.name and enter in your full name. You can also similarly type in git config --global user.mail and enter in your mail address. You will need those two details to be able to work with Git so that there is that information about who performed the changes in terms of adds, modifications, deletes, or so on. Now, just one final thing to understand to wrap up this lesson, I want to highlight that when you're using that git configuration command, you will have noticed I just said use --global. When you do perform that command using --global, it's going to store your config on a per user basis for your computer. So for example, we might use git config global user.name Mike Smith because, whatever repo we're working on our computer as ourselves, our name probably isn't going to change. However, there might be some circumstances where you want to apply settings that actually take effect for the entire computer for every user that works on your computer. And for that, you can use git config --system. For example, you might enter in some changes to modify the editor that Git wants to use. Perhaps you want the default editor to be Visual Studio Code. Now, the final type of Git configuration level that we can work with is something called local with the --local argument, and that's actually config that is going to be specified on a per repository basis. So for example, if you actually did have a different email address that you used for different repositories that you were working with, you could use git config local and specify that email address on a per repository basis. Alrighty folks, so we've been through a few different elements of Git now. You can understand what it is, why we would use it, how we can install it, and the different areas of Git that we will work with, whether we are working locally or remote. Thanks for joining me folks. That's a wrap.